The words hit me like a slap across the face at what was supposed to be a peaceful Christmas dinner. Sitting at the elegantly set dining table in my in-laws' mansion, surrounded by expensive china and holiday decorations, I listened as my mother-in-law Eleanor looked directly at me and declared that I was nothing more than a barren failure who had trapped her precious son in a loveless marriage. What she didn't know was that I had been building my own business empire for the past 5 years, and by the end of that evening, I would be announcing my divorce and taking my fortune with me. My name is Victoria, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who give you the greatest motivation to prove them wrong. The foundation of my troubled relationship with my husband Michael's family had been laid long before that explosive Christmas dinner, rooted in their old money snobbery and their deeply ingrained belief that I was never good enough for their eldest son. The seeds of conflict had been planted from the very first time I set foot in their world, and they had grown into a toxic garden of resentment, judgment, and barely concealed hostility that poisoned every family interaction. Michael came from the kind of generational wealth that creates an insular world of private schools, country clubs, and carefully arranged marriages designed to preserve both social status and financial assets across multiple generations. The Worthington name carried weight in certain circles, opening doors and creating opportunities that most people could never access, but it also came with rigid expectations about behavior, associations, and life choices that brooked no deviation from established traditions. The family's wealth had originated in the early 1900s when Michael's great-grandfather had built a shipping empire that dominated East Coast maritime trade for several decades. That foundation had been expanded through strategic real estate investments, particularly in Manhattan commercial properties that had appreciated dramatically over the past century. By the time I entered the family, their portfolio included office buildings, luxury residential developments, and commercial real estate holdings that generated substantial passive income. But the Worthingtons weren't just wealthy, they were old money in the truest sense, meaning that their fortune had been established long enough to develop the kind of social connections and cultural sophistication that new money couldn't purchase. They moved in circles where everyone's lineage was known, where family names carried more weight than individual accomplishments, and where the wrong background or education could permanently exclude someone from acceptance. Eleanor Worthington embodied everything that old money aristocracy represented, a woman who had been born into privilege, educated at the finest institutions, and trained from childhood to maintain the family's social position through careful management of appearances, associations, and marriages. She had attended Miss Porter's School and Vassar College, where she had studied art history and developed what she considered to be impeccable taste in literature, music, and home decoration. Her marriage to Michael's father had been the kind of strategic alliance that wealthy families had been arranging for centuries, bringing together two fortunes and two social networks in ways that benefited both sides. She had devoted her adult life to managing the family's social obligations, supervising their various properties, and ensuring that the next generation would be properly prepared to maintain their privileged position. Eleanor's approach to motherhood had been heavily influenced by her own upbringing and her understanding of what was required to preserve family status across generations. She had sent Michael and his siblings to the most exclusive private schools, arranged for them to participate in appropriate social activities, and carefully monitored their friendships and romantic relationships to ensure compatibility with family expectations. Michael had been groomed from childhood to eventually take over management of the family's business interests, while his younger brother had been encouraged to pursue law or finance, and his sister had been expected to marry well and contribute to the family's social prominence through her husband's achievements and her own charitable activities. The Worthington estate in Connecticut was a physical manifestation of everything the family represented, a sprawling compound that had been designed to impress visitors while providing maximum comfort and privacy for the family. The main house had been built in the 1920s by a prominent architect who specialized in creating homes for America's wealthiest families, and it featured the kind of timeless elegance that only comes from unlimited budgets and impeccable taste. The interior had been decorated by Eleanor over the course of several decades, with each room carefully curated to reflect both historical authenticity and contemporary comfort. The furniture included genuine antiques that had been passed down through generations, alongside museum-quality pieces that Eleanor had acquired through relationships with exclusive dealers and auction houses. The grounds included formal gardens that were maintained by a team of professional landscapers, walking trails that wound through carefully preserved woodlands, and recreational facilities that allowed the family to entertain guests without ever leaving their property. The stables housed Eleanor's collection of champion horses, which she rode daily and showed in competitions that were attended by other members of their social circle. But beyond the material trappings of wealth, the Worthington family was defined by an intricate web of social obligations, charitable commitments, and business relationships that required constant attention and careful management. Eleanor served on the boards of several prestigious cultural institutions, hosted fundraising events for causes that were important to their social circle, and maintained friendships with other wealthy families that spanned multiple generations. This was the world that I had unknowingly entered when I began dating Michael, a universe governed by unwritten rules that I had never learned and expectations that I had never been prepared to meet. My background in middle-class Ohio had given me many valuable qualities: work ethic, practical skills, and genuine appreciation for opportunities, but it had not equipped me with the kind of social sophistication that the Worthington family considered essential for someone marrying into their circle. The contrast between my upbringing and Michael's had been stark and sometimes uncomfortable, though I had initially attributed any tension to normal adjustment challenges rather than fundamental incompatibility. I had grown up in a household where merit was rewarded, where hard work was valued above inherited advantages, and where authenticity was prized more than appearances. My parents had been loving and supportive, but they had also expected me to earn whatever I wanted through my own efforts rather than relying on family connections or inherited advantages. I had learned to be self-reliant, resourceful, and determined, qualities that had served me well in school and early career development but that sometimes clashed with the Worthington family's expectations about appropriate behavior for women in their social position. The differences had been apparent from my first visit to the Connecticut estate, when I had been overwhelmed by the scale and formality of everything from the dinner service to the conversation topics. Eleanor had been polite but distant, asking questions about my background that felt more like an interview than a social conversation, and I had sensed immediately that I was being evaluated according to criteria that I didn't fully understand. Michael had tried to bridge the gap between his family's world and mine, explaining some of the unwritten rules and helping me navigate social situations that felt foreign and intimidating. But he had also grown up completely immersed in this environment, and there were aspects of his family's behavior and expectations that he simply took for granted rather than recognizing as potentially problematic or exclusionary. The engagement period had been particularly challenging, as Eleanor had taken it upon herself to educate me about what would be expected of me as a Worthington wife. She had provided reading lists of books about entertaining, etiquette guides that covered everything from table settings to appropriate conversation topics, and suggestions for wardrobe changes that would better reflect my new position in society. While some of this guidance had been genuinely helpful, much of it had felt like criticism of who I was and pressure to become someone entirely different. Eleanor seemed to view my middle-class background not as a different but equally valid experience, but as a deficiency that needed to be corrected through education and practice. The wedding planning process had been a particularly intense example of Eleanor's need to control every aspect of family life and her belief that money gave her the right to make decisions for other people. She had dismissed many of my preferences as inappropriate or impractical, substituting her own choices for everything from the venue to the menu to the guest list. I had tried to be gracious about these changes, understanding that the Worthington family was paying for the celebration and wanting to maintain their standards for such events. But the experience had been my first real glimpse into the extent of Eleanor's controlling nature and her inability to consider that other people might have different but equally valid perspectives about important decisions. The ceremony itself had been spectacular by any objective measure, held at one of the most exclusive venues in New York, with flowers flown in from specialty growers, cuisine prepared by celebrity chefs, and entertainment provided by world-class musicians. The guest list had included politicians, business leaders, and cultural figures who represented the pinnacle of American society. But despite the elegance and expense of the celebration, I had felt like a stranger at my own wedding, surrounded by people I barely knew and participating in traditions that felt foreign and impersonal. The event had been designed to impress Eleanor's social circle rather than celebrate Michael and my relationship, and I had begun to understand that this pattern would likely continue throughout our marriage. The Worthington family had made their fortune in shipping and real estate during the early 20th century, and they had spent the subsequent decades cultivating the kind of refined lifestyle that comes with never having to worry about money. Their sprawling estate in Connecticut included a main house with 12 bedrooms, a guest cottage, tennis courts, and stables that housed Eleanor's collection of prize-winning horses. I, on the other hand, had grown up in a middle-class family in Ohio, where my father worked as a mechanical engineer and my mother taught elementary school. We lived comfortably but modestly, and I learned early that anything I wanted beyond the basics would have to be earned through my own efforts. I worked part-time jobs throughout high school, saved money for college, and graduated with a degree in business administration and a burning ambition to build something meaningful with my life. Michael and I had met during my first year working at a prestigious consulting firm in Manhattan, where he was a client representing his family's business interests. I was immediately attracted to his intelligence and charm, while he seemed fascinated by what he called my drive and authenticity. Our relationship developed quickly into something that felt like genuine love and mutual respect, though I was naive about the challenges that would come from trying to fit into his family's rarefied world. The first signs of trouble had appeared during our engagement, when Eleanor made it clear that she had expected Michael to marry someone from their social circle, preferably someone whose family had connections that would benefit the Worthington business empire. She had been particularly vocal about her disappointment that Michael was choosing to marry someone without an Ivy League education or family wealth, though she had attempted to disguise her criticism as concern for our compatibility. The wedding itself had been a lavish affair that cost more than my parents made in 3 years, paid for entirely by the Worthington family as a way of ensuring that the celebration met their standards for elegance and social prominence. Eleanor had taken control of every aspect of the planning, from the venue to the guest list, making it clear that this was a Worthington family event rather than a celebration of Michael and my union. I had tried to be gracious about Eleanor's dominance over our wedding planning, understanding that she was investing significant money in the celebration and wanting to maintain family traditions. But the experience had been my first real glimpse into the extent of her need to control everything in her family's orbit, and her belief that money gave her the right to make decisions for other people. The early years of our marriage had been complicated by the constant pressure to conform to Worthington family expectations about everything from where we lived to how we spent our free time. Eleanor had strong opinions about the appropriate neighborhood for young Worthingtons, the correct social events to attend, and the importance of maintaining appearances that reflected well on the family name. But the most persistent source of tension had been Eleanor's obsession with grandchildren and her increasingly vocal frustration with our failure to produce them quickly enough to satisfy her timeline. She had made it clear from our honeymoon onward that she expected me to prioritize motherhood over any career ambitions, and she had become increasingly critical as months and then years passed without the pregnancy announcement she was waiting for. What Eleanor didn't understand was that Michael and I had been struggling with infertility for several years, a deeply personal and painful experience that we had chosen to keep private rather than subject ourselves to her judgment and unwanted advice. We had undergone multiple rounds of fertility treatments, consulted with specialists, and endured the emotional rollercoaster of hope and disappointment that defines the infertility journey. The medical challenges had put strain on our marriage, but they had also brought us closer together in some ways as we supported each other through the difficult process of accepting that biological children might not be in our future. We had begun discussing adoption and other alternatives, but we had also been working on finding happiness and fulfillment in our relationship without the addition of children. Eleanor's constant questions and comments about our childless state had made this process infinitely more difficult and painful. She had no awareness of the medical realities we were facing, and she seemed to view our lack of children as a personal failing rather than a circumstance beyond our control. Her pressure had become increasingly intense and hurtful, though Michael had been reluctant to confront his mother about her inappropriate behavior. Meanwhile, I had been channeling my energy and frustration into building something that was entirely my own, something that Eleanor couldn't control or criticize. The idea had been germinating for months as I watched small businesses struggle with the rapidly evolving digital landscape while established marketing firms focused primarily on larger corporate clients who could afford premium services. During my third year of marriage, I had made the decision to leave my prestigious but ultimately unfulfilling consulting job to start my own business focused on helping small companies develop digital marketing strategies and online presence. The decision had been both terrifying and exhilarating, representing a complete departure from the safe, predictable career path that someone in my position was expected to follow. The timing had been perfect for entering the digital marketing field, as businesses were just beginning to understand the transformative power of social media, search engine optimization, and online advertising, but most were overwhelmed by the complexity and constantly changing nature of digital platforms. Traditional marketing agencies were slow to adapt to these new realities, creating opportunities for entrepreneurs who could bridge the gap between cutting-edge technology and practical business applications. My background in business consulting had given me the analytical skills to understand what companies really needed to succeed online, while my outsider perspective in the Worthington family had made me acutely aware of how important it was to build something that truly belonged to me. I had spent countless hours researching market trends, studying successful digital campaigns, and developing frameworks that could help small businesses compete effectively against much larger competitors. The initial phase of building the business had been challenging in ways that I hadn't anticipated. I had started with my own savings and a modest business loan, working from a converted bedroom in our Manhattan apartment while Michael was at his family's company during the day. The setup had been sparse but functional: a desk, 2 monitors, a reliable internet connection, and enough determination to work 18-hour days when necessary. Eleanor had been dismissive of my entrepreneurial efforts from the beginning, viewing them as a hobby rather than a serious business venture. She had frequently made comments about how I would need to give up such distractions once I became pregnant and started focusing on my real responsibilities as a wife and potential mother. Her attitude had been consistent with her general belief that women in our social position should dedicate themselves to supporting their husbands' careers rather than building independent professional identities. But my little hobby had grown faster and more successfully than I had ever imagined possible. The first client had been a family-owned restaurant that was struggling to attract younger customers despite having excellent food and a great location. Within 3 months of implementing my digital strategy, they had increased their revenue by 40% and had a waiting list for weekend reservations. Word had spread quickly through networks of small business owners who were desperate for affordable, effective marketing help. Within 6 months, I had a roster of 12 clients who were seeing significant improvements in their online visibility, customer engagement, and sales. The results had been so dramatic that several clients had referred their friends and business associates, creating a steady stream of new opportunities. Within a year, I had hired my first employee, a talented graphic designer named Sarah who had recently graduated from art school and was eager to gain experience in digital marketing. Adding Sarah to the team had allowed me to take on more clients while maintaining the quality of service that was becoming our signature strength. The decision to move into a dedicated office space had been a significant milestone that marked the transition from hobby to legitimate business. I had found a small but well-located space in a building that housed several other startups and creative agencies, creating an environment that was both professional and collaborative. The office had been modest but carefully designed to reflect the kind of innovative, client-focused approach that differentiated my company from larger, more traditional agencies. I had invested in high-quality technology, comfortable furniture for client meetings, and design elements that conveyed both creativity and professionalism. Within 2 years, I was running a company with 15 employees and annual revenues approaching $2 million. The team included specialists in social media management, content creation, web development, and data analytics, allowing us to provide comprehensive digital marketing solutions that could compete with much larger agencies. The success had been intoxicating and validating in ways that I hadn't expected. For the first time in my adult life, I was completely in control of my own destiny, making decisions based on my own judgment and reaping the rewards of my own hard work and vision. The business had given me a sense of identity and accomplishment that was entirely separate from my role as Michael's wife or potential mother to Eleanor's grandchildren. But the success had also created new sources of tension within my marriage and with the Worthington family. Michael had been supportive in principle, but he had grown increasingly uncomfortable with how much time and energy I devoted to the company. He had been raised to expect that his wife would be available to attend social functions and family obligations without the competing demands of a serious career. The scheduling conflicts had become more frequent and more problematic as my business grew. Important client meetings sometimes conflicted with Worthington family events, and I had been forced to choose between professional obligations and social expectations. When I chose the business, Michael felt that I was prioritizing work over family, while Eleanor viewed my choices as evidence that I didn't understand or respect my proper role as a Worthington wife. Eleanor had been even less supportive than Michael, making increasingly pointed comments about how my business commitments were preventing me from focusing on what should be my real priorities. She had suggested multiple times that I should sell the business once it became profitable and focus my attention on more appropriate activities for someone in my position: charity work, social obligations, and preparation for motherhood. The tension had escalated significantly during our 4th year of marriage, when my company had been featured in several business publications as one of the fastest-growing marketing firms in the region. The media attention had brought new clients and opportunities, but it had also made it impossible for Eleanor to continue dismissing my work as a trivial hobby. The articles had described my journey from consulting to entrepreneurship, highlighted the innovative approaches we were using to help small businesses succeed online, and positioned me as a thought leader in the digital marketing space. One particularly prominent feature had included a photo of me in my office, surrounded by my team and the awards we had won for campaign effectiveness. Instead of being proud of my achievements, Eleanor had become openly resentful of the attention and recognition I was receiving. She seemed to view my success as a threat to the family's social standing, particularly because my business background was so different from the traditional industries where Worthington money had been made. She had made several comments about how new money and entrepreneurship were somehow less respectable than inherited wealth and established businesses. She had also become increasingly aggressive about pressuring Michael and me to have children, as if my professional success made it even more important for me to fulfill what she saw as my primary obligation as a wife. Her comments had become more personal and hurtful, and she had begun making disparaging remarks about career women who prioritized money over family responsibilities. The situation had reached a preliminary breaking point during the previous year's holiday gathering, when Eleanor had made a comment about how some women were simply too selfish to make good mothers, while looking directly at me across the dinner table. Michael had finally spoken up to defend me, but the intervention had come too late and had been too mild to address the underlying disrespect that Eleanor consistently showed toward me and my choices. That incident had been a wake-up call that forced me to examine not just my relationship with Eleanor, but my entire marriage to Michael. While he had eventually defended me that night, it had taken far too long for him to speak up, and I had begun to question whether he would ever be willing to truly stand up to his mother on my behalf when family dynamics conflicted with support for me. I had also begun to realize that my marriage was not providing me with the emotional support and partnership that I needed to thrive both personally and professionally. Michael was a good man in many ways, but he had been shaped by a lifetime of privilege and family expectations that made it difficult for him to understand my ambitions or appreciate my achievements in the context I needed. The success of my business had given me financial independence that most women in my situation didn't have, and I had started to consider what my life might look like if I chose to leave the marriage. The prospect was both terrifying and liberating, representing a complete break from the life I had built over the past 5 years while opening up possibilities that I had never previously considered. By the time that fateful Christmas dinner arrived, my company had grown to a valuation of over $10 million, with offices in 3 cities and a reputation that extended far beyond our original regional market. I employed over 50 people, had been invited to speak at major industry conferences, and had been recognized as one of the most successful female entrepreneurs in the digital marketing space. But none of these achievements had earned me respect or acceptance from Eleanor, who continued to view my success as an unfortunate distraction from my real responsibilities as a member of the Worthington family. Her inability to acknowledge or appreciate what I had built had become a source of increasing frustration and anger that was affecting every aspect of my relationship with Michael and his family. The timing had been perfect for entering the digital marketing field, as businesses were just beginning to understand the importance of social media, search engine optimization, and online advertising. My background in business consulting had given me the analytical skills to understand what companies needed, while my outsider perspective helped me identify opportunities that established marketing firms were missing. I had started the business with my own savings and a small loan, working from our home office while Michael was at his family's company during the day. Eleanor had been dismissive of my entrepreneurial efforts, viewing them as a hobby rather than a serious business venture, and she had frequently made comments about how I would need to give up such distractions once I became pregnant. But my little hobby had grown faster than I had ever imagined possible. Within 6 months, I had a roster of clients who were seeing significant improvements in their online visibility and sales. Within a year, I had hired my first employee and moved into a small office space. Within 2 years, I was running a company with 15 employees and annual revenues approaching $2 million. The success had been intoxicating and validating in ways that I hadn't expected. For the first time in my adult life, I was completely in control of my own destiny, making decisions based on my own judgment and reaping the rewards of my own hard work. The business had given me a sense of identity and accomplishment that was separate from my role as Michael's wife or potential mother to Eleanor's grandchildren. Michael had been supportive of my business success, though I sometimes sensed that he was uncomfortable with how much time and energy I devoted to the company. He had grown up expecting that his wife would be available to attend social functions and family obligations without the competing demands of a serious career, and my increasing success was creating scheduling conflicts that sometimes frustrated him. Eleanor had been even less supportive, making increasingly pointed comments about how my business commitments were preventing me from focusing on what should be my real priorities as a Worthington wife. She had suggested multiple times that I should sell the business once it became profitable and focus my attention on more appropriate activities for someone in my position. The tension had escalated during our 4th year of marriage, when my company had been featured in several business publications as one of the fastest-growing marketing firms in the region. The media attention had brought new clients and opportunities, but it had also made it impossible for Eleanor to continue dismissing my work as a trivial hobby. As Christmas approached that year, I had been dreading the annual family gathering while also knowing that it might be my last opportunity to address the ongoing problems with Eleanor's treatment of me. I had hoped that perhaps the holiday spirit might inspire more charitable behavior, but I had also been prepared for the possibility that things might get worse before they got better. The dinner had started normally enough, with the usual carefully orchestrated discussions of family business, social events, and holiday plans that characterized all Worthington family gatherings. Eleanor had been in her element as the hostess, directing the household staff with military precision and ensuring that every detail of the meal met her exacting standards for elegance and sophistication. The dining room had been decorated for the holidays with the kind of understated luxury that only comes from unlimited budgets and impeccable taste. Fresh flowers flown in from specialty growers adorned the center of the massive mahogany table, while crystal stemware caught and reflected the light from an antique chandelier that had been in the family for 3 generations. The china service was spode Christmas rose, a pattern that Eleanor had been collecting for decades and only brought out for the most special occasions. Michael's younger siblings and their spouses had been present with their children, creating the kind of multi-generational family scene that Eleanor treasured as evidence of the Worthington family's continued prosperity and social prominence. The conversation had flowed easily among topics that were familiar and comfortable to everyone except me: updates on various business ventures, gossip about mutual acquaintances from their social circle, and planning for upcoming charitable events and social obligations. Robert, Michael's younger brother, had been sharing details about his recent promotion to partner at his Manhattan law firm, while his wife Catherine discussed their plans for a winter vacation in St. Moritz. Michael's sister Amanda had been describing the private school application process for her eldest daughter, comparing the merits of various exclusive institutions with the kind of detailed knowledge that comes from having navigated these waters multiple times. The children, ranging in age from 5 to 14, had been perfectly behaved in the way that comes from extensive training in appropriate social behavior. They answered questions from adults with polite responses, demonstrated proper table manners without prompting, and generally conducted themselves with the kind of poise that Eleanor had demanded from her own children and now expected from her grandchildren. I had been making a genuine effort to participate in the conversation and contribute to the festive atmosphere, despite feeling increasingly isolated from the family dynamics swirling around me. The topics of conversation rarely touched on areas where I had relevant experience or insights, and when they did, my contributions were often met with polite but dismissive responses that made it clear my perspective was not valued. The meal itself had been spectacular, featuring traditional holiday dishes prepared by Eleanor's longtime chef with ingredients sourced from the finest suppliers. The progression from appetizers through multiple courses to dessert had been flawlessly timed and presented, with each dish accompanied by carefully selected wines that complemented the flavors perfectly. As the evening progressed, the conversation had gradually turned to New Year's resolutions and plans for the coming year, with various family members sharing their goals and aspirations for both personal and professional achievements. Robert had discussed his ambitions for expanding his law practice, while Catherine had outlined her plans for taking a more active role in several charitable organizations. Amanda had been describing her goals for her children's educational and social development, while her husband had shared his excitement about a new business venture that he was launching with several partners from his business school network. The children had been encouraged to share their own resolutions, which ranged from improving academic performance to mastering new sports or musical instruments. When the conversation had turned to Michael and me, I had sensed an opportunity to perhaps finally gain some recognition for my professional achievements by sharing my plans for expanding my business into new markets and service areas. I had begun describing the opportunities we were exploring in international markets, the new technologies we were developing, and the industry recognition we had been receiving. For a moment, I had felt genuinely hopeful that perhaps this time, my success would be acknowledged and appreciated by the family. The business metrics I was sharing were objectively impressive: revenue growth, employee expansion, client satisfaction rates, and industry awards that positioned my company as a leader in our field. But Eleanor's response had been swift and devastating. Rather than showing interest in my achievements or pride in my success, she had dismissed my business expansion plans as irrelevant compared to what she saw as my real failure as a wife and woman. Her words had been delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who felt completely entitled to pass judgment on other people's lives and choices. The phrase barren failure had been pronounced with particular emphasis, as if Eleanor wanted to ensure that everyone at the table understood exactly what she thought of me and my contributions to the family. She had been responding to Michael's mention of my business expansion plans, dismissing them as meaningless distractions from what she considered to be my primary obligation as his wife. The words had been delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty that for a moment, the entire table had fallen into stunned silence. Even Eleanor's other children, who were accustomed to her sharp tongue and demanding personality, had seemed shocked by the harshness and public nature of her assessment. The attack had been so unexpected and so cruel that no one seemed to know how to respond immediately. I had sat there in my carefully chosen holiday dress, surrounded by expensive china and crystal, feeling the familiar mixture of hurt and anger that Eleanor's comments always provoked, but also experiencing something new and clarifying. The public nature of her attack, delivered in front of the entire family during what was supposed to be a celebration, had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. In that moment, listening to her casual dismissal of my worth as a human being, I realized that I was done trying to earn her respect or acceptance. Years of attempting to prove myself worthy of inclusion in the Worthington family had culminated in this moment of absolute rejection, and I finally understood that no amount of success or achievement would ever be enough to change Eleanor's fundamental assessment of my value. I had also realized that Michael's failure to immediately and forcefully defend me represented a fundamental problem in our marriage that could not be fixed with counseling, compromise, or time. A man who could sit quietly while his mother called his wife a barren failure in front of the entire family was not someone who would ever truly be my partner or advocate in the ways that mattered most. The silence that followed Eleanor's comment had stretched for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only seconds. I could see Michael's face reddening with embarrassment or anger, but he still hadn't spoken up to defend me or challenge his mother's assessment. His siblings had been looking uncomfortable, but they too seemed unwilling to confront Eleanor's behavior directly. The financial independence I had built through my business meant that I didn't have to tolerate Eleanor's abuse or remain in a marriage that was no longer serving my emotional needs. I had options that most women in my situation didn't have, and sitting there at that elegantly appointed table, I realized that I was going to use them. The clarity that came with this realization was extraordinary and liberating. For years, I had been trying to fit into a mold that was never designed for someone like me, accepting criticism and judgment from people who had never bothered to understand my background, my goals, or my values. The pretense that we could all eventually find a way to coexist peacefully had been shattered by Eleanor's public declaration of my fundamental inadequacy. I had taken a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and prepared to make an announcement that would change everything. The decision felt both spontaneous and inevitable, as if all the events of the past 5 years had been leading to this moment of absolute clarity about what I needed to do next. Looking around the table at the faces of people who had never truly accepted me as part of their family, I had felt nothing but relief and empowerment as I prepared to deliver my own devastating news. For years, they had been judging me according to their narrow standards while completely failing to understand or appreciate what I had accomplished outside of their insular world. The realization that I could simply walk away from all of it, taking my success and my dignity with me, was extraordinarily liberating. I didn't need their approval, their social status, or their family money. I had built something valuable with my own hands and mind, and that achievement belonged entirely to me, regardless of their opinion of its worth or relevance. I had stood up from the dinner table, my chair scraping slightly against the polished hardwood floor, and announced that I had something important to share with the family. The words had come out clearly and calmly, despite the enormous magnitude of what I was about to reveal. I told them that I would be filing for divorce after the holidays, that I would be taking my business and my assets with me, and that they would never have to worry about my failure to produce Worthington grandchildren again. The announcement had been delivered with the same matter-of-fact certainty that Eleanor had used when calling me a barren failure, and it had had an equally devastating effect on the family gathering. The response had been immediate and dramatic. Eleanor had turned pale and begun sputtering about the family's reputation and the embarrassment of a divorce, as if my departure would somehow reflect poorly on her rather than simply removing a source of ongoing conflict from her life. Her concern had been entirely focused on how my decision would affect the family's social standing rather than any genuine sadness about the end of my marriage to her son. Michael had looked shocked and confused, as if he couldn't believe I was serious about leaving despite years of mounting tension and his consistent failure to support me against his mother's attacks. His reaction had confirmed that he had been completely oblivious to how unhappy I had become in our marriage and how damaging his family's treatment had been to our relationship. His siblings had exchanged glances that suggested they were trying to calculate the financial implications of my departure, wondering whether my business success might somehow affect their own inheritance prospects. The children had looked confused by the adult drama unfolding around them, though the older ones had clearly sensed that something significant and troubling was happening. But I had felt nothing but relief and empowerment as I delivered my announcement. For years, I had been trying to fit into a mold that was never designed for someone like me, accepting criticism and judgment from people who had never bothered to understand my background, my goals, or my values. The realization that I could simply walk away from all of it, taking my success and my dignity with me, was extraordinarily liberating. I didn't need their approval, their social status, or their family money. I had built something valuable with my own hands and mind, and that achievement belonged entirely to me. I had stood up from the dinner table, thanked them for their hospitality over the years, and walked out of their mansion for the last time. The drive home had been surreal, filled with a mixture of sadness about the end of my marriage and excitement about the possibilities that lay ahead. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe freely, no longer constrained by expectations that had never made sense for someone with my background and ambitions. The future was uncertain, but it was mine to shape according to my own values and priorities rather than someone else's narrow definition of appropriate behavior for women in their social circle. I had been making an effort to participate in the conversation and contribute to the festive atmosphere, despite feeling increasingly isolated from the family dynamics swirling around me. The discussion had turned to New Year's resolutions and plans for the coming year, with various family members sharing their goals and aspirations. That's when Eleanor had made her devastating comment about my status as a barren failure, speaking with the casual cruelty of someone who felt completely entitled to pass judgment on other people's lives. She had been responding to Michael's mention of my business expansion plans, dismissing them as irrelevant compared to what she saw as my real failure as a wife and woman. The words had been delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty that for a moment, the entire table had fallen silent. Even Eleanor's other children, who were accustomed to her sharp tongue and demanding personality, had seemed shocked by the harshness of her assessment. I had sat there in stunned silence, feeling the familiar mixture of hurt and anger that Eleanor's comments always provoked, but also experiencing something new, a crystalline clarity about what I needed to do next. In that moment, listening to her casual dismissal of my worth as a human being, I realized that I was done trying to earn her respect or acceptance. I had also realized that Michael's failure to immediately and forcefully defend me represented a fundamental problem in our marriage that could not be fixed with counseling or compromise. A man who could sit quietly while his mother called his wife a barren failure was not someone who would ever truly be my partner or advocate. The financial independence I had built through my business meant that I didn't have to tolerate Eleanor's abuse or remain in a marriage that was no longer serving my emotional needs. I had options that most women in my situation didn't have, and I was going to use them. I had taken a deep breath, looked around the table at the faces of people who had never truly accepted me as part of their family, and made an announcement that would change everything. I told them that I would be filing for divorce after the holidays, that I would be taking my business and my assets with me, and that they would never have to worry about my failure to produce Worthington grandchildren again. The response had been immediate and dramatic. Eleanor had turned pale and begun sputtering about the family's reputation and the embarrassment of a divorce. Michael had looked shocked and confused, as if he couldn't believe I was serious about leaving. His siblings had exchanged glances that suggested they were trying to calculate the financial implications of my departure. But I had felt nothing but relief and empowerment as I delivered my announcement. For years, I had been trying to fit into a mold that was never designed for someone like me, accepting criticism and judgment from people who had never bothered to understand my background, my goals, or my values. The realization that I could simply walk away from all of it, taking my success and my dignity with me, was extraordinarily liberating. I didn't need their approval, their social status, or their family money. I had built something valuable with my own hands and mind, and that achievement belonged entirely to me. I had stood up from the dinner table, thanked them for their hospitality over the years, and walked out of their mansion for the last time. The drive home had been surreal, filled with a mixture of sadness about the end of my marriage and excitement about the possibilities that lay ahead. The divorce proceedings had been complicated by the prenuptial agreement that Eleanor had insisted we sign before the wedding, but my business assets had been protected because they had been built entirely during the marriage with my own efforts and resources. The company's valuation had grown to over $10 million by that point, making me financially independent in ways that the Worthington family had never imagined possible. Michael had initially tried to reconcile, apologizing for his mother's behavior and promising to set better boundaries with his family. But the damage had been too extensive and fundamental to repair. I had lost faith in his willingness to truly support me, and I had also realized that I didn't want to spend the rest of my life fighting his family for basic respect and dignity. The settlement had been surprisingly generous, partly because Michael felt guilty about his mother's treatment of me and partly because my attorney had been skilled at negotiating from a position of strength. I had walked away from the marriage with my business, my personal assets, and enough additional money to fund my next chapter without any financial constraints. Eleanor's reaction to the divorce had been predictably dramatic and self-centered. She had been furious about the damage to the family's reputation and had tried to blame me for destroying Michael's life and future prospects. She had also been shocked to learn about the true value of my business, having apparently assumed that my company was worth far less than it actually was. The media attention surrounding our divorce had been intense but ultimately beneficial for my business, as it had highlighted my success story and attracted new clients who were impressed by my entrepreneurial achievements. Several business publications had written profiles about my journey from middle-class background to millionaire entrepreneur, and I had been invited to speak at conferences about women in business and overcoming obstacles. Michael had eventually remarried, choosing a woman from an appropriate family background who shared Eleanor's values about the proper role of wives in wealthy families. They had produced the grandchildren that Eleanor had been demanding, and from what I heard through mutual acquaintances, they seemed content with their traditional lifestyle. I had also found love again, though in a very different context. My partner David was a fellow entrepreneur who understood and appreciated my ambitions, and who supported my goals without trying to change or control me. He came from a similar middle-class background and shared my values about hard work, authenticity, and mutual respect. Our relationship was built on genuine partnership and shared interests rather than social expectations or family pressure. We collaborated on business projects, traveled together to industry conferences, and created a life that reflected our own values rather than anyone else's expectations. The business continued to grow and evolve, expanding into new markets and service areas as the digital marketing industry matured. I had opened offices in 3 cities, employed over 50 people, and developed a reputation as one of the leading experts in my field. The company had become profitable enough to provide financial security for decades to come. But perhaps more importantly, the experience of standing up to Eleanor and choosing my own path had taught me valuable lessons about self-worth, boundaries, and the importance of surrounding myself with people who valued and supported my authentic self. Today, my life is filled with work that I love, relationships that support and challenge me, and the freedom to make choices based on my own values and priorities. The fortune I took with me when I left the Worthington family has continued to grow, but more importantly, it has given me the independence to live authentically and pursue goals that matter to me. The business has become a platform for supporting other women entrepreneurs, particularly those from backgrounds similar to mine who are trying to build something significant without the advantages of family wealth or social connections. I have created mentorship programs that pair successful business owners with promising startups, provided seed funding for women-led companies that traditional investors might overlook, and used my success to open doors for others who might otherwise struggle to gain access to opportunities. The mentorship program has been particularly rewarding, allowing me to share not just business knowledge but also the emotional skills needed to navigate the challenges of building a company while dealing with people who don't believe in your potential. Many of the women I work with have faced similar dismissals from family members or social circles who couldn't understand their ambitions or appreciate their achievements. I've also established an annual scholarship fund that provides full business school tuition for women from middle-class backgrounds who want to pursue entrepreneurship but lack the financial resources to invest in advanced education. The recipients are selected based on their business plans, their determination to succeed, and their commitment to using their success to help other women follow similar paths. The foundation work has given my business success a deeper meaning that extends far beyond personal financial gain. Each woman who builds a successful company with our support represents a victory over the kind of narrow thinking that Eleanor embodied, proof that talent and determination exist in every community regardless of social background or family connections. The experience with Eleanor and the Worthington family had been painful and difficult, but it had also been transformative in ways that I couldn't have imagined at the time. Sometimes the people who treat us worst end up being the catalysts for the changes that lead us to our best lives, forcing us to examine our situations with clarity that we might never achieve without such dramatic wake-up calls. Looking back now, I can see that Eleanor's cruelty had actually been a twisted form of gift, though certainly not one she intended to give. Her words had forced me to confront the reality that I would never be accepted by people who valued inherited status over earned achievement, and that recognition had freed me to stop trying to earn approval that was never going to be granted regardless of my accomplishments. The psychological liberation that came with this understanding had been as important as the financial independence my business provided. For years, I had been unconsciously limiting my own potential by trying to fit into expectations that were designed for someone completely different from who I was. Eleanor's public rejection had shattered those constraints and allowed me to pursue goals that reflected my own values rather than someone else's narrow definition of appropriate success. That Christmas dinner confrontation had been the end of one chapter of my life and the beginning of another that has been infinitely more rewarding and authentic. Eleanor's cruel words had been intended to break me down and force me to accept a diminished role in the family hierarchy, but instead they had helped me break free from a situation that was limiting my potential and diminishing my happiness. The divorce proceedings had been surprisingly straightforward, partly because the prenuptial agreement Eleanor had insisted on actually protected my business assets, and partly because Michael felt genuinely guilty about his family's treatment of me. The settlement had been generous enough to allow me to start my new life without any financial constraints, while the company's continued growth had provided security that extended far beyond what any divorce settlement could offer. Michael's reaction to the divorce had evolved over time from shock and denial to eventual understanding and acceptance. He had initially tried to reconcile, promising to set better boundaries with his family and create a marriage that prioritized our relationship over his mother's expectations. But the damage had been too extensive to repair, and he had eventually come to understand that our fundamental differences in values and priorities made long-term compatibility impossible. He had remarried within 2 years, choosing a woman from an appropriate social background who shared Eleanor's values about family structure and gender roles. From what I heard through mutual acquaintances, they seemed content with their traditional lifestyle and had produced the grandchildren that Eleanor had been demanding. The contrast between his new wife's acceptance of family expectations and my rebellion against them had probably made everyone involved grateful for the change. Eleanor's reaction to my success had continued to evolve in interesting ways over the years following our divorce. Initially, she had seemed determined to dismiss my achievements as temporary luck or market anomalies that would eventually collapse under the weight of my inexperience and inappropriate background. But as my company continued to grow and gain recognition within the business community, she had been forced to acknowledge that my success was both substantial and sustainable. The media attention surrounding my entrepreneurial journey had made it impossible for her to continue pretending that my achievements were insignificant, particularly when business publications began featuring me as an example of innovative leadership in the digital marketing space. I had heard through mutual acquaintances that Eleanor now spoke of me with a grudging respect that she had never shown during our marriage, though she still maintained that my priorities had been misguided and that a proper wife would have chosen family over career. The irony that her cruelty had actually enabled my success seemed to be lost on her, as she continued to view our relationship through the lens of her own narrow worldview. The fortune I announced I was taking with me that night wasn't just money, it was the confidence, skills, and determination that had allowed me to build something valuable despite the obstacles and criticism I had faced. That fortune continues to grow and compound, creating possibilities that extend far beyond anything Eleanor could have imagined when she made her devastating comment about my being a barren failure. The phrase barren failure had been intended to reduce me to my perceived shortcomings and make me feel worthless in the eyes of the family and myself. But sitting here now in my corner office overlooking the city, surrounded by awards and recognition from industry organizations, I understand that Eleanor's assessment had been fundamentally wrong about what constitutes success and value in life. I wasn't barren in any meaningful sense. I had created jobs for dozens of people, built relationships that spanned continents, and made a positive impact on countless businesses and communities through my work. My company had helped small businesses thrive, had supported women entrepreneurs in achieving their dreams, and had demonstrated that innovation and determination could overcome traditional barriers to success. The failure hadn't been mine, it had been the failure of people who couldn't see past their own prejudices and limited perspectives to recognize value that didn't fit their narrow definitions. Eleanor's inability to appreciate achievements that didn't conform to her expectations said far more about her limitations than mine, and I had finally stopped allowing her judgment to define my self-worth. Today, my life is filled with work that challenges and fulfills me, relationships that support and encourage my ambitions, and the freedom to make choices based on my own values rather than someone else's expectations. The fortune I took with me when I left the Worthington family has continued to grow exponentially, but more importantly, it has given me the independence to live authentically and pursue goals that matter to me. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone who underestimates you is the opportunity to prove them wrong on a scale that exceeds their capacity to dismiss or diminish. Eleanor had given me that gift through her cruelty, and I had made the most of it in ways that transformed not just my own life, but the lives of many other people who benefited from the success I built on the foundation of her dismissal. The barren failure she described that Christmas night had walked away from her dinner table and built an empire that continues to thrive and expand today. That empire is powered by the determination of someone who refused to accept other people's limitations on her potential and worth, and who used their underestimation as motivation to achieve something extraordinary. The sound of Eleanor calling me a barren failure still echoes in my memory sometimes, but now it serves as a reminder of how far I've come rather than a source of pain. Those words had been intended to destroy my confidence and force me to accept a diminished role, but instead they had become the catalyst for building a life of purpose, achievement, and authentic happiness that Eleanor could never have imagined possible.